𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪. In this video, I will explain Class 12th Political Science Chapter 6, which is the crisis of democratic order. Now, if you remember the last chapter in which we talked about how the Congress party recovered in the elections of 1971 and Indira Gandhi was the one to recover the party because Congress was about to lose its dominance. Now, in this chapter, we will see the politics of the country, the democratic institutional politics of the country from the period of 1973 to 1975, and basically, we will be seeing the imposition of emergency in 1975 because emergency has been considered controversial in the regime of Indira Gandhi, and it has been seen that that normally we like to associate the emergency provisions in the country with war and aggression or with natural disaster. But now Indira Gandhi had imposed emergency because of the perceived internal disturbance in the country, and that's why she imposed emergency in the country. So we will be asking some questions in the chapter which have remained controversial over the years. Firstly, why was emergency imposed? Was it necessary to impose emergency in the country? Secondly, what is the practical situation in emergency? How was it imposed? What were the conditions of the opposition parties, the leaders of the opposition parties, and the common people? Thirdly, we will be seeing the impact of the emergency on the party politics of the country. We will be seeing a lot of things related to the emergency in the country and how after 1972 the politics of the country was in turmoil, how the institutional balance of the country was in chaos because it was a time when judiciary, legislature and executive were fighting each other. So we will be seeing all these things related to the imposition of emergency in the country in 1975. And without any further ado, let's get started with the first topic, which is background to emergency. Now, what was the background story of emergency? Because if the emergency had been imposed in the country, then there must be some reasons. No one would like to impose emergency just for some naive reasons or some for trivial matters. Now, from the period of 1972, there were many things going in the country. Firstly, Indira Gandhi had emerged as a tremendous leader with tremendous popularity in the country. She was seen as a savior by the poor sections of the society. Another thing was that this was the period when there were many controversies, there were many conflicts between the judiciary and the executive. Executive was seeing judiciary as an obstacle to the implementation of pro-poor welfare programs. It was seeing judiciary as a conservative institution, and judiciary was saying that the executive was making such decisions, the legislature was making such laws which were against the principle of democracy in the country. Another thing was that now the split was very clear in the Congress party. We had already seen in the last chapter that Congress would split into two parties. First was the Congress R, which is the Congress Requisitionist, the main party of Indira Gandhi. And another was Congress O, the Congress organization consisting of the syndicate, and this was completely split out. After the split, what happened was that many non-Congress opposition parties came together. Another thing going on was the welfare of the poor people, because there were many bad politics going on in the country. So what about the common people in the country? What about the ordinary citizens in the country? What about their welfare? Because if there is a country and there is democracy in the country, then there must be development of the people as well. So let's see the background of emergency as well. The first thing, that is economic context. Now, in 1971, we had fought a war with Pakistan, and that was when Bangladesh came into being. Now, before the war, about 8 million people from East Pakistan crossed the border to India, and they took refuge in India in the state of West Bengal. Now, what would happen? Because we had already fought the wars in 1965, 1962. Of course, there would be some lack of resources in the country to accommodate such large number of people was a huge task. Another thing was that in the international context, the prices of oil had risen on. That means that the prices will be so high that it would be hard for India to buy the oil. Another thing, after the 1971 war, the US forces had stopped all the aid to India because we already saw that Soviet Union was with us and the US was supporting Pakistan. The US, Pakistan and China axis, we have already studied about it. So it was very common that after the 1971 war, the US government stopped all the aid to India. Then what would happen? Of course, the economic condition of India will worsen. Another thing was that the war had drained the resources of the country. It put an economic strain on the country, and that is why we had to stop after the third 5-year plan as well. We had to take a planned holiday. What would happen? That there was a diversion of the resources of the expenditure from the welfare, from the development of the country to the military expenditure, because we had to win the wars, and that is why it was hard to fulfill the promise that Indira Gandhi had given in the 1971 election, which was with the slogan "Garibi Hatao," which means remove poverty. So was the poverty really removed from the country? No, it wasn't. In fact, the situation of the country even worsened. What happened? The prices of essential commodities such as essential oil, food grains, many other essential commodities had risen so much, which led to inflation in the country. In 1974, it was 30%. So you can say that such a high inflation will cause chaos in the country, will cause unrest among the people, and that is why a lot of food scarcity was seen in the country, because in 1972, monsoons had failed in the country, and that is why there was 8% decline in the food output rate in the country, which means that there will be less production. And if there is less production of the agriculture, then what would happen? Of course, there will be food shortage in the country, and many people will have to suffer starvation. Another thing was that due to not having such expenditure, there was a lot of unemployment in the country. Another thing was that, of course, if there was less economic expenditure, if there was less income of the country, then what would happen? Government decided to stop the salaries of the government employees, and that caused dissatisfaction among the government employees as well. So for sure, we can say that after 1972, the economic condition of India was not at all good. Many things were going on, and that is why there was an economic strain in the country. And this caused a lot of unrest among the people. Many students' protests were now being seen against the high prices, against the inflation in the countries, against unemployment, against corruption. And that is why there are two major movements that we will be studying in this chapter, which are Gujarat and Bihar movements. Now, both these states, Gujarat and Bihar, were Congress-ruled states. Firstly, let's study about Gujarat. As you know that Gujarat in 1974, in January 1974, there were many protests that were initiated by the students against the high prices of food oil, of food grains and essential commodities, and against corruption as well. Now, what happened? They demanded that there would be re-elections in the state, and there was a prominent leader at that time, which was Morarji Desai. We have already studied about him. He was the main opponent of Indira Gandhi when he was in the Congress. Now he was a part of Congress O, and now he said that he would go on an indefinite fast if there were no elections, re-elections in the state. And that is why, being forced, left with no options, the re-elections had to be conducted in the state, and in that election the Congress had been defeated. So we can say that Gujarat movement played a very important role at that time. Another movement was in the state of Bihar. There also the students initiated the movements, and they took the support of a very popular leader at that time, which was J.P. Narayan. Now, J.P. Narayan had given up the active politics in 1955. What happened that he decided to join the movement, to lead the movement, because the students asked his support to lead them because he was a great leader, and that is why he decided to join the movement on the condition that the movement will not be limited to just Bihar but would be spread as a nationwide struggle, and that is why this movement from Bihar was seen as a nationwide struggle as well as with a popular struggle with political ideologies as well. This was also against inflation, against corruption, for better prices and for employment in the state. Now what happened, it was seen that many people saw this movement as against Indira Gandhi rather than the state governments. They said that it was seen as if they were against the personal authority of Indira Gandhi. They were for personal reasons. So we can say that Indira Gandhi considered these movements as a political opposition to her, personal opposition to her, rather than the opposition to state governments. And you know what, that when the movements in Bihar had been initiated, they were considered very good. They had demanded for re-elections in the state, but the Congress party, of course, denied these accepts. Now many political opposition parties, the non-Congress opposition parties such as Congress O, the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, the Socialist Party, supported 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 Narayan because he came to be known as a political leader, as a nationwide popular leader. Why so? Because earlier, from the movement time of 1942, he had been considered as a hero, as a national hero in the Quit India movement that played a very important role in the independence of the country. And even after that, he had been considered a very good leader. He had been the founder Secretary General of the Indian National Congress, and he had left the active politics in 1955. Also participated in the Bhudan movements, and you already know what the Bhudan movements are. So we can say that he was seen as a political leader who was nationally popular in the country and was considered as a substitute or as an alternative to Indira Gandhi. But now what happened, that many people now started criticizing him. After some time, when the movement had been initiated, they had been done for a long time. Now many questions came up about his ideologies, about many things, that were the movements really against the state governments or were they just against Indira Gandhi? Another thing that happened with these movements was that they also provoked other movements in the country, such as railway strikes in the country. There was a National Coordination Committee for Railwaymen's Struggle, which was led by George Fernandez. He called for a nationwide strike in the country if the demands of the railwaymen were not accepted by the government. Now, these demands were for bonus and service pay in the country for the railwaymen. Now, naturally, the Congress party denied these accepts, superseded these demands of the struggle, and that is why in May 1974, the National Coordination for Railwaymen's Struggle, which was led by George Fernandez, started a nationwide strike. Now just think about it. The largest public sector in the country at that time went on a strike, not just for a day or 2 days, but for more than a week, for 20 days. What would happen even today if the railways are stopped for a long time? Of course, firstly, the people wouldn't be able to move from one place to another place because there are very good transportation facilities. Another thing, the goods would also be not transported because there are many trains that are used for transporting the goods in the country, and that is why the development, infrastructure development of the country would also be stopped. After the strike had been initiated by the committee, what happened that for some time the Congress starting using the territorial army to protect the railway tracks. They deployed the territorial army so that the railway tracks would not be harmed. Another thing that they did was to arrest the leaders of the struggle, the leaders of the strike. And after 20 days, when the railwaymen saw that, the workers saw that there were no no improvements in their condition, and that is why after 20 years the strike had been stopped. But it provoked many other things. Firstly, the labor unrest in the country. It also raised questions about the rights of the workers and whether they had the right to protest against the government. Because just think about it, if the public sector stopped working, went on a strike, then what would happen? Of course, the situation of the country wouldn't be good. The country would be stopped for a long time. And that is why there were many questions that were raised on the rights of the workers as well. The third backdrop of the emergency was, of course, the conflict with judiciary. In class 11th, we studied about the conflict between Supreme Court and the Parliament, which was in the same period. Now, in this time, there were three major questions, or there were three major controversies between the Supreme Court and the Parliament. First was, could the Parliament abridge or amend the fundamental rights of the people? The Supreme Court said that it cannot. The fundamental rights are forcible by the Supreme Court. They are the guardians of the fundamental rights, and that is why the Supreme Court said that the Parliament cannot amend the fundamental rights. Second question was that, could the Parliament curtail the right to property? The Supreme Court said it cannot curtail the right, any fundamental right of the citizens. It cannot amend the Parliament in such a manner that rights are curtailed. The third controversy was that Parliament said that it could amend the Constitution as it wants to give way for directive principles of state policy, because they considered that these were necessary for giving way to directive principles for the development of the country. We know that all these conflicts were resolved in the famous judgment in 1973 of 𝓥𝓲𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪 case. We know that in 1973, in the 𝓥𝓲𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪 case, the Supreme Court gave a judgment about the basic structure, doctrine of the Constitution, that Parliament can amend any part of the Constitution except the basic structure of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court would be the one who would decide that what comes inside the basic structure, so that the core principles of the Constitution are not amended. Just think what would happen if the Parliament had the right to amend any part of the Constitution and they just demolished the federalism structure of the country or the right to equality. Then what would happen? That is why the Supreme Court established a basic structure doctrine in the country. Another thing was that there were two major things that led to more conflicts between the Parliament or the executive, the legislature, and judiciary. The first was that the appointment of Chief Justice. Now, normally, when a Chief Justice is appointed, the President appoints the senior most judge of the Supreme Court. But now what happened? Three senior most judges of the Supreme Court had been superseded, and Justice A.N. Ray had been chosen as the Chief Justice of the country. Now, it was seen as controversy because these three judges had given judgments, had given rulings against the Congress party. Another thing was, of course, the famous statement that was given by Allahabad High Court, which declared the election of Indira Gandhi as invalid. So what was it? Let's discuss that as well with the next topic, which is Declaration of Emergency. So, declaration of emergency. Now, let's see that how the emergency was established, was imposed in the country. Just as I said that there were two major controversies that happened after the 𝓥𝓲𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪 case in 1973. The three senior most judges of the Supreme Court had been superseded. Next one was that the Justice 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 Sinha from Allahabad High Court gave a judgment against the valid elections of Indira Gandhi. He declared that the election of Indira Gandhi as a Prime Minister as an MP was invalid. He gave that judgment on a petition filed by 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪, a socialist leader who had contested against Indira Gandhi in 1971. Now he accused Indira Gandhi that she used the government servants, the public bureaucrats, for her personal use for election campaigns in the 1971 elections. What the court exactly said was that now legally she was an MP. Indira Gandhi remained an MP, but now she could not be the Prime Minister, and that is why if she wanted to remain in that position, she would have to be elected again in 6 months. Now, after that, in the Supreme Court gave a partial stay order on High Court, which was that she would have a stay order. Indira Gandhi would have stay order until an appeal was made. So we can say that on 12 June 1974, the election, there were questions rising against the elections of 1971 against the winning victory of Indira Gandhi in 1971 elections. Now, what happened after that? Let's see that as well with the next subtopic, which is crisis and response. What was the crisis? Now, when the opposition parties saw that the condition of Indira Gandhi wasn't that good, she was going to the courts for her appeals, for her trials, and that is why they saw it as a good opportunity. Now they could be united and have a good political struggle in the country for re-elections. Now, these opposition parties were led by J.P. Narayan, who was seen as a great leader. And what he did was that on 25 June 1975, you could say that in Delhi, in Ramlila grounds of Delhi, he organized massive campaigns, massive political campaigns that had never been seen ever before. And why he did so? To organize his strike, organize his struggle, organize his movement in the country. What happened after that? After he organized massive struggles, he wanted Indira Gandhi to resign. The government of Indira Gandhi to resign, and new Prime Minister will be chosen for the country. What happened after that? This invoked the Article 352. According to Indira Gandhi, what she said was that this invoked the emergency provisions of the country. Now, at that time, the provision of emergency was a bit different from today. Today, it's written as armed rebellion or with external aggression, that is, the war and aggression from external forces. But earlier, it was internal disturbance. So, according to Indira Gandhi, it invoked a threat of internal disturbance in the country, which needed emergency provisions, according to Article 352 of the Constitution. Now, it has been amended. According to Article 352, at present time, instead of internal disturbance, it's written as armed rebellion in the country. What happened that she saw that the country wasn't in a good condition. There were many things going on simultaneously. Many protests going on, strikes going on by worker class, by students. There were conflicts with judiciary as well. The economy of the country was going down, and that is why Article 352 had to be imposed, according to her. What happened? What happens in emergency? Particularly, it gives power to the government, to the legislature, to Prime Minister, to the Council of Ministers. What happens that at that time, all the federal structure of the country is suspended and all the power is concentrated in the hands of the central government. Secondly, the central government can stop, prohibit any or all of the fundamental rights at the time of emergency. So we can say that even right to life and liberty can be taken away from you at the time of emergency. So we can say that overall all the power goes to the central government if the emergency provisions are imposed, because there can be some situations in a particular region where emergency is needed. It could be due to natural disaster, due to any activity such as terrorism, failure of law and order, like martial law is imposed. So we can say that on 25 June In the day, the strikes were organized in the Ramlila grounds, and at the same day, at midnight of 25 June 1975, what happened? Indira Gandhi recommended to the President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad of the country that there should be imposition of emergency in the country, and that is why we can say that at the midnight of 25 June 1975, the emergency was imposed in the country. And what happened with the emergency? The cabinet minister didn't even get to know that the emergency was imposed in the country. They got to know about the emergency imposition at 6 a.m. in the morning. So we can say that while everyone was sleeping, Indira Gandhi just imposed emergency in the country. Now, what did the imposition of the emergency mean in practical situation? Let's see that as well with the next topic, which is consequences. What were the consequences of the emergency? Firstly, all the rights had been taken away. The political strikes were banned. The freedom of press was banned as well, which means that all the newspapers, magazines, journalists had to take approval of the central government before they could write anything. So that it's called as censorship. Censorship was imposed. Freedom of press was taken away. And at the time of imposition, all the electricity to all the newspaper offices, major newspaper companies was taken off. So we can say that so that they would not be able to produce the newspaper, to print the newspapers. The political leaders from the opposition parties were arrested as well, and government took a good use of the preventive detention. What did preventive detention mean? It means that a person is detained or arrested before any offense is committed by him. It is done so that in the future that person cannot commit any crime. So we can say that freedom of press had been abolished during the time of emergency. Another thing that came up with emergency was that the door to the judiciary had been closed by the government as well. What happened that many people went to the high courts or different levels of courts saying that their fundamental rights, their civil liberties had been taken up. They wanted to file petition against that, and several high courts gave judgments that even at the time of emergency, they have the power to issue the writ of habeas corpus. Now, if you remember, under the Article 226 of the Indian Constitution, High Court has the power to issue the writs in case of violation of the fundamental rights. So, many of the fundamental rights gave judgments that they could issue the writs of habeas corpus even at the time of emergency, but this was overruled by the Supreme Court of India, saying that at the time of emergency, even the right to life with liberty could be taken up by the government and they had no right to interfere. So we can say that completely the doors to the judiciary had been closed up. Political leaders had been arrested, the political movements, struggles had been stopped. We can say that the politics of the country was now quiet, though tense, but it was quiet. Did anyone resist against this? Of course they did. Several newspapers like the Indian Express and Statesman left blank spaces in the front page showing that they were not allowed to write at that part. So they were showing the issue of censorship through their newspapers. Magazines, there were many magazines that came up and closed themselves rather than choosing to adopt the values, the principles of censorship. So we can say that many newspaper magazine offices closed down rather to accept the censorship imposed on them. There were also some political leaders who went underground, which means that away from the eyes of the government so that they could organize the struggles in the country. However, we say that these kind of resistance were very rare. There were writers such as Kannada writer Shivnath Ram and many other writers, Hindi writers as well, who gave up their awards as well, Padma Vibhushans, Padma Shris as well, in respect to the emergency that was imposed in the country. So they were against the imposition of emergency, and that is why they gave up their awards to the central government. However, these kind of resistance were very rare. At the time of emergency, we saw that many cultural leaders, the religious leaders, such as the leaders of 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪𝓷, the leaders of Jamaat-e-Islam, these were also banned by the central government because they saw the communal disharmony in the country, the religious and communal disharmony in the country, and that is why organizations such as 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪𝓷 and Jamaat-e-Islam had been banned as well. Many questions came up as well at the time of emergency. Where did all those political leaders go who had not been arrested and who were just bluffing before the imposition of emergency? What happened to all those religious leaders? What happened to ordinary citizens who were organizing protests? So we can say that at the time of emergency, there were many grave consequences because emergency was imposed on the country, and seeing the threat of internal disturbance which could lead to grave consequence in the country. However, there were many questions that raised upon emergency as well because many things had been changed during the time of emergency. One of such things was the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, which is also known as the mini constitution because in this Constitutional Amendment Act, many provisions of the constitution were amended. What happens, just for take the example of the time period of Lok Sabha. Generally, the Lok Sabha's term of office is 5 years, but at that time it had been increased up to 6 years. Now, from the period of 1975, the emergency had been imposed, and after the emergency, the elections could be held only 1 year later. It means that next elections were to be held in 1978. Another provision that was added was that no question on the validity of elections of the president, the vice president, and the prime minister of the country could be raised upon. And these changes were permanent in nature. They were not just meant as temporary, just for the time period of emergency. They were considered as of permanent nature, because Indira Gandhi was facing questions on her validity of elections, and that is why these kind of provisions were made as well. The 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act itself was very controversial. Now let's see what happened after the emergency with the next subtopic, that is lessons of emergency. What did we learn from the emergency? Because after emergency, many of the situations of the country changed. Firstly, was the question on the democracy, because at the time of emergency, of course, the democracy was just forgotten. Nothing democratic was happening in the country. Many critics, many political thinkers came up saying that after emergency, the democratic constitution, the democratic institution in the country had been abolished. However, we see that after the emergency, the democracy had been strengthened. Now people are more aware of the democracy, the importance of democracy in the country, and that is why after the emergency, it is noteworthy that the democracy still continued. The first lesson that was learned from the emergency was that the democracy of the country of India could not be abolished at all. Second lesson was that that at the time of emergency, we saw that the balance, before emergency, there were kind of balance of democratic institution in the country and the protests of the people. How much right do the people have to have to protest against the government? Should the protests be in such a manner that it would stop the working of the government? So there were kind of questions that came up about the right balance between the democratic institution in the country and the popular protests, the public protests of the country. Another question was the uses of army and military. You know what, that the police force, the armed forces of the country were used for the imposition of emergency. So we can say that they had to face a lot of political pressures. Even in 1974, on 25 June, when J.P. Narayan launched massive campaigns in Ramlila grounds of Delhi, what happened? He asked the government employees, the military officials, the police force to not obey the immoral and undemocratic rules or orders of the government. So we can say that he instigated the army to be independent of the government, and at the time of emergency, they were facing political pressures. They could not work independently. They had to impose the emergency in the country. So we can say that we learned a lot of lessons. Another thing was that the provision of armed rebellion and internal disturbance. As I just said, that after this emergency, the provision of internal disturbance has been rectified. Now the internal emergency can be imposed only in the case of armed rebellion, and the recommendation to the president about the imposition of emergency should be signed with the members of the union cabinet. It doesn't have to be just the prime minister, just an individual's choice. Rather, it should be with the signatures of all the members of the union cabinet. So we can say that now the provisions with the emergency in 1975, because it was the first time that emergency was imposed in the country, we learned a lot of lessons, so that in the future upcoming time, if any situation like that persists, then it can be held up. Another provision about the emergency in the country is that according to Article 352, the time period of emergency can last up to only 6 months. After 6 months, there would be a need of another recommendation to the president, so that another extension of the period from 6 months to another 6 months could be done. So we can say that now many limitations on the imposition of emergency provision have been done, so that these kind of situation can be prevented in the possible upcoming time. Now we saw the crisis, the response of the emergency. Now let's see about the political situation, the campaigning, the election system of the country, whose party was formed after the emergency in the country. With the next topic, which is politics after emergency. So politics after emergency. Now what happened after emergency? After 18 months, the emergency was lifted up. Now, in the 1977 Lok Sabha elections, the verdict was completely based on the experience of emergency. It was seen that emergency played a very big role in the election verdict of 1977, and many opposition parties came together in those elections, and it turned a referendum. The elections of 1977 were turned into referendum for the people, so that they would be voting on the experience of the emergency. Now, what exactly happened? Of course, the Congress was defeated, and it was a very big defeat. For the first time in the history of the Indian National Congress after independence, they had been defeated in the Lok Sabha elections. And how exactly were they defeated? Let's see that as well with the next subtopic, which is Lok Sabha elections 1977. So Lok Sabha elections 1977. In January 1977, the government lifted up the emergency and released all the political prisoners. And in March 1977, the elections were to be held. Clearly, the opposition did not have time to do all the preparations for the elections. However, the politics of the country was formed very rapidly. There were political changes that happened in the country very rapidly. Why? Because we know that from the pre-emergency period, many non-Congress leaders, the non-Congress opposition leaders were coming together, and now after the emergency they came together to form a party known as Janata Party, which was led by the leader J.P. Narayan. Now, what happened? This Janata Party included all the major opposition parties, and it even had allies from other parties. For example, there was a party which was led by a very popular leader, 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪, and the party was Congress for Democracy. It also joined hands with Janata Party. The Socialist parties, the Bharatiya Janata Dal, the Kranti Dal, all joined this particular Janata Party. So we can say that it was seen as an umbrella party which was to hold up so that the votes against Congress would not be divided. They would be united, and thus they would be able to form a majority. In 1977, the elections were held, and the results surprised many, because The Congress party had been defeated and it got only 154 seats in the Lok Sabha elections. And we already know that in the 1967 elections, they got more than 350 seats. So it means that they had lost very badly. Talking about the Janata Party and its allies won more than 300 seats. They won around 320 to 30 seats. And Janata Party itself won 295 seats, which means that it itself had gotten a clear majority. A clear majority, which means that, as you know, that in Lok Sabha elections, any candidate or political party needs to secure 272 seats to secure a clear majority to form the government, and that's what happened here. The Janata Party itself got 295 seats. Talking about the share of votes, that also fell off. The Congress party got less than 35%. So we can say that the defeat was very clear and the impact was majorly seen in the northern states of the country, because the impact of emergency was very large in the northern states. Congress lost all its seats from Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, from all the northern states. However, they did manage to get some seats from the southern states. They performed average, or we could say well, in the southern states, but in northern states they performed very badly, because in the southern state the impact of emergency was very low, and that is why Congress got many seats. And thus, that's why we can say that the elections of 1977 are seen as a referendum which was based on the imposition of emergency, because emergency played a very important role here. People had suffered here. Another thing was the issue of backward classes. All the middle classes, the backward classes, moved from Congress to Janata Party, and they supported Janata Party because Congress claims to be the only party which was pro-poor, which was pro-socialist in the country, but the development wasn't seen, and that is why the backward classes, the middle classes, went from Congress party to the Janata Party, and that's why this was another factor which led to the defeat of the Congress party in the 1977 elections. And not just in the Lok Sabha election, even in the state assembly elections which were held just after these elections, there also they saw very great defeat. There was very bad defeat of the Congress party. So 1977 election was a bad time for the Congress party. Now, after Janata Party had won the election, what happened? Who formed the government? Let's see that as well. Janata government. Now, talking about the Janata Party, after the election, it wasn't any near to being a cohesive party. Why? Because after the results of the elections came out, there was a stiff competition to be the prime minister among three major leaders. First was Morarji Desai. Morarji Desai, who has been a very great freedom fighter, who has been minister in the cabinet of Jawaharlal Nehru as well, the major opponent of Indira Gandhi, as well as member of parliament for so long, ministry of the cabinet. You can say that he was a very experienced person. More than 70 years was his age. So of course, he was a very aged person and had been deputy prime minister and temporary prime minister of the country. Another leader was Chaudhry Charan Singh. Now, Charan Singh was seen as an agrarian leader. He was an agricultural leader from the state of Uttar Pradesh. He had been twice the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, had been national freedom struggler as well. So we can say that he was also a very qualified leader for this post. He had been a deputy prime minister from the period of 1977 to the period of 1979 as well as the home minister of the country. Another leader was J.G. Ram. Now, J.G. Ram was also a very qualified leader. He had also been a minister of parliament, had held many ministries. He was a labor minister in the first ministry of Free India, which was led by Jawaharlal Nehru. After that, from 1955 to 1972, he was a member of parliament in the country. He was also a member of the Constituent Assembly. He was also the deputy prime minister from the period of 1977 to 1979. So we can say that he was also a very qualified person. Now, there was many stiff competition between these three leaders, and finally Morarji Desai was chosen as the prime minister of the country. He became the first non-Congress Prime Minister of the country, because Congress had been defeated very badly. Even Indira Gandhi from this constituency of Raebareli, she had stood up for the contesting an election, but she lost there as well. And even her son Sanjay Gandhi from the constituency of Amethi had lost. So we can say that was why Morarji Desai was chosen as the Prime Minister. But the competition between these three leaders hadn't ended up. What happened? The government wasn't seen at all as coherent. Why? Because they didn't have a clear direction. They didn't have a clear political agenda. They couldn't form a different, separate, fundamental ideology from Indira Gandhi. Another thing was that it was seen that Janata Party in itself was fighting very much, and that is why it was very easy to topple it, and that's what happened. After 1979, the Janata Party split up in many parts, and after that Morarji Desai lost his majority, and that is why a new Prime Minister was chosen on the support of Congress, which was 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 Singh. Now, this support by the Congress party was also later taken away, and that is why 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 Singh was the Prime Minister of the country only for 4 months. From the period of, you could say 1979 to 1980, only for 4 months he was the Prime Minister of the country. And that is why we say that Janata Party's government was so unstable and quarrelsome. And thus, a new conclusion can come up in our minds, which is that the public wouldn't want an unstable and a quarrelsome government. They would want a government which is stable, which can listen to their demands. Just think about it. There is a cartoon given in your book as well. There are the parties, the leaders are fighting among each other with loudspeakers, and then there is a common person whose voice wouldn't be heard of, and that's what happened. Because when Janata Party formed the government, what happened? They were just fighting among themselves. In the election of 1977, they had a very popular slogan of "Save Democracy," because democracy was abolished completely in the period of emergency. That is why, just as Indira Gandhi had "Garibi Hatao," they had "Save Democracy." But even after their formation of government, they couldn't see a difference. The demands of the people weren't heard. Their condition didn't improve. And that is why elections had to be held again in 1980. Can you imagine? 1977 election, then again in 1980 elections were held up. And then the Congress party formed the government. So we can say that in 1977 election, Congress was defeated, but in 1980, it formed the government because Janata Party was unstable. Their votes got also divided in 1980 because they weren't together, because their ideologies were different. Just think about how do different socialist party, communist party, right-wing parties, left-wing parties could come together just for defeating Congress. Their main focus was on defeating Congress, wasn't defeating Indira Gandhi, rather than the development of the country, rather than formulating a clear fundamental direction of their party. And that is why in 1980 elections were again held up and Indira Gandhi succeeded in forming the government. Now here comes the last part of the chapter, which is the legacy of the emergency. So legacy. Now let's see the legacy of the Congress party as well, before the emergency and after the emergency, because we already know what have we concluded, what have we gotten as a crust of these two chapters, because both the chapter, this and the previous chapter, both are connected. We saw that Indira Gandhi revived the party, but now the Congress party wasn't the same. Firstly, they claimed to be the only party which was pro-socialist and pro-poor, which means that it stopped accommodating the different factions, the different sections of the society. As we know, one of the important, unique features of the Indian National Congress in the chapter One Party Dominance was that it contained a lot of factions, but now they weren't factions. Those factions became independent parties. Another thing was that now it wasn't an umbrella party. It was a simple different party when it was formed. So we can say that now the Congress party had changed. Another thing was that in these politics, backward classes played a very important role, because because of the shift of votes from the backward classes led to the defeat of the Congress Party in the 1977 elections, and the victory of the Janata Party in 1977 elections. And after the government was formed as Janata Party, the Mandal Commission was set up for the reservation of the other backward classes. We will see about the role of backward classes in the politics of the country in the last chapter of this book as well. So we can see that there is a great legacy before the emergency and after the emergency. After the emergency, people got to know that the importance of civil liberties. Now they saw that how important their civil liberties were, and judiciary also played a very important role in protecting these civil liberties, which it could not do at the time of emergency. So we can say that now people were aware of the democratic process in the country, about democracy in the country, how these things went on and how they needed to protect their rights. Another thing was that, of course, the popular protest, the public protest, how much should they be? Should they stop the working of the government, or should there be no such right given to them to have protest against the government? So a balance between the democratic institutions and you could say the popular protest of the public remains to be very controversial, and that's what we'll be studying in the last chapter as well. So that is all we have studied in this chapter. We saw that why emergency was imposed in the country because of different reasons: the economic context, the high inflation, the food scarcity in the country, food shortages, unemployment, then the conflict between the Supreme Court and the Parliament, which resulted in Kesavan and Bharati case, but still remained. The question on the validity of elections on Indira Gandhi, it was the first time when the Prime Minister went to the court to give her statements. It was a big thing at that time. Another thing, we saw that there were many politics that were coming up. The opposition parties came together. They realized that the need to not divide, to unite themselves and not divide the votes against the Congress Party, and what they call as non-congressism. That non-congressism was a theory that was very popular at that time, which was used to defeat the Congress Party at any cost. Even if they have to be together, they still did that to propose a theory of non-congressism. So we could say that these things happened, and emergency was imposed. All the leaders went into the jail. They were arrested. The freedom of press was superseded. There were many things went on, and after the emergency, the results came up of the 1977 election, where the Congress was defeated. So I've covered all the topics and subtopics of this chapter, and the next chapters of this book will be covered in the further upcoming videos. So stay tuned for upcoming videos. Thank you very much.